Amen. Warm Christian greetings again, everyone. And let me extend, heartfelt thanks to you for being here with us another time in our Bible study. And we have been continuing on our topic of divorce and remarriage. And I really want to give God thanks for those who have been tuning in for this broadcast. Let me greet everyone who is on the YouTube platform, along with those who are joining us on the Zoom platform. Such a privilege to have you with us and a delight to be sharing with you in Bible study. Indeed, I can join with the song man when he requests or he kind of retorts, really. And he says, sing them over again to me. Wonderful words of life. Let me more of their beauty see. Wonderful words of life. I want to believe, everyone, that the word of God continues to be the guide that points each and every one of us to the kingdom and how we are to walk as kingdom people. And so even as we go into our study this evening, I want to remind us that we are the salt of the earth and we are the light of the world. And based on Jesus's dictates, he declares that if we no longer serve as salt and light, then we are good for nothing, but to be trodden under the foot of men. And I want to believe tonight that those of us who are here looking into the word are not going to fall prey to that level of depravity wherein we don't shine and we don't salt the earth, so to speak, or season the earth, that we have to be cast out under the foot of men. And so I want to direct our attention to our continued study. I have titled this evening's study, Staying versus Leaving, Striving and Surviving versus Crashing and Burning. And I want to just give us a small recap of what we went through last week, because again, everybody, the marriage and divorce discussion is one that is rife with controversy. But most times in the midst of the debate, we forget what the standing principle is, because we look at the permissive allowance for remarrying, not understanding the kind of gravity that God placed on the marriage intact, as opposed to the marriage destroyed and a desire to be remarried. And one of the things that we're going to look at this afternoon or this evening is the fact that the Bible knows that marriages are not perfect in a broken world. And there are going to be some areas that we can look at this evening that will kind of give some nuance to the argument and will also help us to kind of put into context some of the things that need to be done. Now, last lesson, we looked at the fact that it is marriage and not divorce that was mentioned in God's original plan. Therefore, marriage is of God, divorce is not. Marriage is of God, divorce is not. And I think there has to be a very strong stress on this, especially for those who are not yet married, for us to understand that the draw for marriage can be very strong, but we must enter into marriage understanding what it is. And we looked at it last week that marriage is for purpose, not merely for pleasure or companionship. So one, it is in God's original plan. Two, it is designed for purpose, not merely pleasure. Thirdly, divorce, as it came in, was not commanded, it was allowed. I want you to get that. It was not commanded of Moses. It was allowed. So when the Pharisees said that Moses commanded, that's not true. And Jesus, in answering, said that Moses did not command it, but because of the hardness of your hearts. We also looked at the fact that divorce came as a result of that. Hardness of heart. The unloving, uncaring, selfish, self-gratifying idea that marriage must be what one individual wants it to be. and the other individual shall not be given the opportunity to actually be a part of it. In other words, it is the, as my grandmother would say, is either you DO or you GO. And that kind of stubbornness without care for the other party. I like what the book Letters to Karen says about marriage. It says, marriage is not about finding the right partner. It's about being the right partner. And if all of us determine to be the right partners, then we are sure that marriage will be successful. No, the bill of divorcement was not a spiritual entity in itself. It was not something spiritual. Not at all. Marriage is spiritual. The bill of divorcement was actually a societal grant given, yes, for the protection of a dismissed wife. So on the one hand, it is a human law that was made because of the hardness of the hearts of the men of the time. And it was for the protection of the woman. But rest assured, here's it. The bill of divorcement, based on how Moses wrote it, gave the wife the right to be remarried. Right? And I want to give some context. As I stated earlier, remember that the women did not work. They were dependent upon the men in order for them to survive. And it was either she was going to go back to her father's house when this man would put her away, apoluo, put her away, not divorce her, just separate from her. And she would either go back to her father's house for her father to take care of her, or she would turn to prostitution, for which she could be stoned to death. And so the idea is that the bill of divorcement, which was a societal thing, was given to the wife to protect her innocence, that she could remarry again. Now, let me share this, brothers and sisters. Remember that the very punishment for adultery was death. It was not divorce, it was death. And so you find that the punishment for adultery or for adultery would probably be imposed upon someone who is put away if they did not have any alternative but to enter into a relationship that was deemed unlawful. And one of the things that we stressed in the last lesson is that while nobody's 100% wrong and nobody's 100% right within a marriage, I believe we're all broken people. But at the ending of the day, love and forgiveness are the utmost of ethics. That is what God is saying. When Jesus said, love them that hate you, pray for them that despitefully use you, he's literally pulling on the idea that love is the supreme ethic and forgiveness is its twin brother. And so the very woman of your breast or the man who stands by you, if those who hate you are worthy of forgiveness, according to what Jesus said, or they're not worthy, but we are commanded, then I want to believe that forgiveness and love must also govern how we deal with those closest to us. Let's continue. Now in our recap of Jesus, as he answered the first question regarding marriage, he aligns himself with the prophet Malachi. Malachi declares fully that God says, I hate divorce. And that word hate there is strong in the Hebrew. I detest divorce. And it is something that we have to bear in mind, that unlike the Hollywood personnel and the people of North America, and in particular those areas that are quite liberal, yes, the San Francisco, the California, the New York, those places, quite liberal places, sometimes they literally boast on the amount of divorces that they've had, But the idea is that divorce is never something to be celebrated. I was on Facebook the other day looking at a party that they were having. I have heard of engagement parties. I have heard of birthday parties. I participated in some of the different type of parties you had, Sweet 16 and such alike. But for the first time, I saw a divorce party where the woman was celebrating her divorce. And I'm like, this is just crazy, right? The reality why God would hate divorce is simple. His original plan did not involve divorcing at all. The Creator made the race male and female. And we're still in recap, everybody. The sexes are to be united in marriage. I want you to get that. So the race is created with two entities. The unification of these two entities that make the race is through the institution of marriage. In other words, marriage is what unites the race, right? The sexes are to be united in marriage. So when in chapters 2, verse 24 of Genesis, when God says, for this reason shall a man leave his mother, it refers to Adam's perception of the woman. Remember, the woman was the only one in creation that looked like him. The woman was the only creature in creation that was attractive to him. The woman in creation is the only one that could keep Adam warm at night. So Adam, when he saw her and he perceived her, he says, this woman is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. For the animals were made from the earth. I, Adam, was made from the earth, but woman was made out of me, right? In other words, she was made from him and made for him. The man and the woman were related. So the idea of bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh is that Adam is saying, I'm not related to the goats. The cows are nice, but I'm not related to them either. The peacocks are pretty, but I can't identify with them. But the woman that God gave me, he said, you are bone of my bone. You are flesh of my flesh. You shall be called woman, for you were taken out of man. That's the strong bond relationship between a man and a woman. And so the one flesh that is spoken of, that is in every marriage structure between a man and a woman, is reenacting the testimony, by God, of the very structure of humanity as God created it. One race existing in two genders. In the same way we declare as Trinitarians, one God eternally existing in three persons. While we cannot speak of the human race in its current form as eternally existing, we can speak of the human race that literally exists in two persons or in two genders, male and female. So you can understand why the enemy is trying to confuse the world with regards to gender, disrupting further the order of God. He started with disunity, damaging the family. He moved on to divorce, and now he's moving to a place where he literally is causing the people of God to be confused. So you find that the testimony of the one flesh speaks to the structure of how God created that men and women should actually exist in the earth as one flesh. Jesus makes clear that the husband and the wife are no longer two, but one. And this is God's doing. This is God's doing. And this particular segment, speaking of God's doing, highlights the idea, and I said it to you last week, that Jesus never said, who God hath put together, let no man put asunder. He said, what God has put together, let no man put asunder. The marriage of a man and a woman is the human recognition and the honoring of God's creative order. That's what it is. It is man and woman coming together according to God's unshakable design. Divorce, on the other hand, is rebellion. So if what God has joined together, right, according to the structure of his own creation, and man seeks to pull it apart, then we find that divorce is a kind of rebellion. In other words, especially those of the Old Testament who regard marriages very highly, the idea of honoring the Creator has to go above selfish means and selfish ambitions. And divorce often results as a result of selfish ambitions. Now, one of the things that I've actually shared with many of the people that I've counseled is that oftentimes divorce, or I wouldn't say divorce, let me be a little more gentle, that within marriage, most of the problems are caused by one of three entities. One is communication, two is sex, and three is power, control, and money. So the idea is that because there are particular tenets within marriage that can be manipulated to make an individual feel good, sometimes individuals forget that they are one flesh and kind of seek to have a leg up on the other person. In other words, their idea of marriage must be that which is manifested in the marriage, even if that is to the detriment of the other person. So I've sat down and I've listened to many, many persons whose marriages may have challenges. And it comes down to their expectations in marriage. And because their expectations are not met, they seek to leave the union because it does not fit and it's not pleasing what they desire. But you find that if the marriage union is to be brought into disrepute for any selfish or self-seeking or self-serving reason, we find that it is rebellion against God's order, because the original life of Adam and Eve was destroyed because of original rebellion. Because man wanted what he wanted and woman wanted what she wanted, and ergo the mess we are in today. But the essence of the rebellion of man is so high that what God unites, man seeks to divide. Let's see if I can run up. Many of the Jewish leaders of Jesus' time, they saw infidelity, to one spouse as the taking of another man's wife. Jesus analyzed the sanctity of marriage by focusing on the unity of the couple, not just the taking of a man's wife. Because marriage is grounded in creation. Marriage is grounded in the way we were created. And so that is why even when we are teenagers coming up, even before that, we start to see somebody we like. We are designed for that. And sometimes as we go along, you look and you see individuals, and these individuals literally, are seeking somebody to be joined with. Why? Because we are designed that way. So it is very, very important that we recognize that marriage and the desire to have companionship and to share with someone else is normal, natural, and something that God gave us. Divorce now, on the other hand, is what is the alien. So, watch this, everybody. I'm finishing this section quickly. Marriage is not simply a covenant relationship that breaks down when the covenantal promises are broken. No, sir. Moses permitted divorce and remarriage. If Moses permitted it, he did so because the sin that was in the marriage was so vile that divorce was the lesser of two evils. Let me say it again. If Moses permitted divorce, which was not a part of God's perfect plan, it implies that living in that marriage, the sin was so pronounced that divorce was preferred to the marriage. In other words, to the continued indecency that was taking place there. That's according to Against David Atkinson. Now, let me read from Frank E. Gablin as I conclude this recap. Moses is not implying that the person who divorces his spouse is wrong, but simply that divorce testifies that there was sin in the marriage. That shouldn't be so in. I'm sorry, it's a typo. Testifies that there was sin in the marriage. Right? So it's not that the person who divorces is wrong, but the sin that exists within the marriage pushes the person to divorce. And if it was a selfish situation, Moses would say that your heart was hard. Your heart was hard, sorry. No, Frank E. Gablin puts it this way. He says, therefore, any view that of divorce and remarriage, taught in either testaments, that sees the problem only in terms of what may or may not be done, has already overlooked the basic fact. Divorce is never to be thought of as a God-ordained, morally neutral option, but it must be seen as evidence of sin, of hardness of heart. Frank E. Gaebelein. And so, again, I want to reiterate that Jesus' stance on marriage is that divorce is antithetical to the original plan and must only be engaged. And as we go down, you're going to see just how you can literally work it out in terms of our everyday lives and living. But divorce was never a part of God's plan. Jesus stood up like Malachi and declared with what he said, or implied rather, that God is a hater of divorce. Now, if we're going to kind of get, a good view of the practical outworking of the argument of Jesus, we have to go to the Pauline epistles, the Corinthians in particular in this case. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is a famous text with regards to the marriages and divorces and all those topics when it comes down to the Christian life. So let me read from 1 Corinthians 7 verses 1 through to 5. Paul speaking. He says to the church, "Now, concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Yes. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath no power of her own body, but the husband. And likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. Defraud ye not the other, except it be with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency." First of all, let me give you a little background here. Apparently, the Corinthians church, in their letter to Paul, had written to him regarding the idea of marriage and the whole concept of the relationship between man and woman as it relates to intimacy, right? And Paul is responding here. Now, I want you to recognize something. He says, "You wrote to me regarding these things, and it is good for a man not to touch a woman." And I have to kind of give you the understanding here. The idea is that it is not so much so that a man should not seek intimacy with a woman, because anything is wrong with it. But in this particular case that Paul is looking at, what they wrote unto him about, that is what he's responding to. So I want you to get that. So he says, in your case, whatever you wrote to me about, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, and that is intimately. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication. And let me tell you something here. The word fornication here is porneia. It does not mean sex before marriage. No. Fornication here, the porneia, means sexual uncleanness. It speaks to, I don't want to go ahead of myself, but it speaks to incest. It speaks to things such as prostitution. It speaks to adultery. It speaks to bestiality. It speaks to homosexuality. It speaks to every form of sexual uncleanness. All right? So it's not just zeroing in on a man who is not married, having sexual intimacy. So Paul says, let every man have his own wife, right? And, every woman her own husband. And within that union, there must be mutual respect. So let the husband give unto the wife respect. And the wife must give honor to her husband, right? He said when it comes on to the sexual union, the woman must not use her body as a weapon against her husband, because it does not belong to her, it belongs to him. And the husband should not use his body as a weapon against his wife either, because it belongs to her. So let me just put it in context here. You know, the body of the man belongs to the woman, and the body of the woman belongs to the man. In other words, if the man goes outside and abuses his own body or his body with another person within the context of the marriage, he has trespassed. He has done wrong because the body does not belong to him. It is his wife's possession. And if the woman, in trying to get her way, in using witchcraft over the husband to get him to do what she wants to, decides to withhold intimacy from him, she literally is a witch, because she's literally using what is the man's to stop him from possessing what is his. Paul is literally saying that you are one flesh. And so at no time must the power of intimacy or the marriage union become a struggle. Why? Because it creates a fissure for Satan to come in and to damage the marriage, right? Just want to put that there. So the church at Paul's time wanted to know whether it was more spiritual to be celibate, and of course we know that means to remain without marriage, or being married. So Paul was saying to them that celibacy, the ability to be without sexual intimacy, is a gift and it is honorable. But let me tell you something about it, brothers and sisters. Jesus spoke of it in chapter 19 of the book of Matthew. He said that it is a gift and it is not for everyone. Yes? So the idea of celibacy, because to be celibate means that one would have dedicated their entire lives to God without having a partner or a wife or a husband, and without indulging in sexual activity. The idea is not trying not to have sexual pleasure, really. It is to have such a high regard for God that the individual has decided that they are going to commit their lives wholly and fully to the work of the Lord without any form of sexual intimacy. We see this in the story of Hannah. Hannah was actually in the temple when Jesus was brought to be dedicated as a child. And it says that Hannah was married for 7 years. And after her husband died, she decided to continue with the Lord fully. Anna was 84 years old when the time when Jesus was being christened, or being, I shouldn't say christened, being dedicated, sorry. But she remained faithful to the Lord because she stayed in the temple night and day, fasting and praying, giving herself to that. That's a gift that God gives to some people, yes? And a decision that person's made. It is not a command. And it doesn't mean that the person who is celibate is better than the one who is married. Absolutely not. No. Right? Because to be celibate is not the best state for everybody. To be celibate is permitted in the kingdom. It is not commanded. And so Jesus says some men are eunuchs for the gospel's sake. They have made up their mind that they're going to be that, and God has given them the grace needed. In other words, a person doesn't take on to be celibate if they are unable to control themselves. It not gonna work. It will not work. To be celibate carries, or requires rather, great discipline. Let me run on. So Paul speaks, and hear what Paul says. Paul says that the idea of the married and the widows, unmarried rather, that should be the unmarried, so it's a typo right there, and the widows are categories of single people. But there's a third category, the category of virgins. So Paul speaks of, watch this, the unmarried, and you're going to see it in verse 10. He speaks of the widows, so he kind of separates them, two categories. But there's a third category called the virgins. Why is this important? Let me share. No, Let me define them first. Virgin, the parthenoi, speaks of single people who have never been married. I'll repeat that. Virgins here refer to single people who have never been married. Widows, adikeres, speaks of single people who were formerly married, but the spouse had died. And the unmarried is not ahamos, it's agamos, but I'll leave that there. The unmarried comes from a word meaning to be married, and it is given what we call the a negation. So it means to not be married. Let me say it again. The agamos is literally, that is a word that is used for unmarried. So remember, the virgin is the one that was never married, sexually pure. The widow is the one that was married, but by virtue of death is single. And the unmarried, the agamos, speaks of one, or the word agamos means wedding or marriage. And when you put the a negation on it, making it agamos, so the original word is gamos. But when you put on the alpha negation, this a right here, everybody, if you're looking at the pointer, this a right here negates this word. So it makes this word the opposite of what it really is. It speaks of not married, not having wedding, or not wedded. It is used 4 times in the New Testament and all 4 times in this chapter. The word is used to describe a person who is not married, not a person who was never married. So in verse 8, he speaks to unmarried women and widows. So he said, I say therefore to the agamos, the unmarried, and the widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. So the unmarried here is not speaking of virgins. And the unmarried here are not widows. In this text of verse 8, the agamos, which is used for unmarried here, is not referencing virgins. We see a different word used for virgins in verse 25. And the unmarried is not speaking of widows because the widows are highlighted differently, right? So remember, everybody, here are the 3 words: the parthenoi, virgins, single people who are never married; widows, the charis, single people who are formerly married but spouse have died; and the agamos, yes, unmarried people, people who are not married. They're not virgins and they're not widows. Then what are they? Let's look. The best insight to determine who the agamoi are the agamos. Agamos is the plural. Yes? Comes to us from verses 10 and 11. Hear what Paul says. And unto the unmarried, or unto the married rather, I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Let not the wife depart from her husband. Depart here is used as a euphemism for divorce. But if she departs, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. If you look at the highlighted portion, the individuals being spoken of here, are spoken to here, are married Christians. And how I know is that Paul is speaking in the mood of command. So he's using the imperative. He says, and unto the married, I'd put in parentheses here, unto the married Christians I command. And he doubles down by appealing to the higher authority, yet not I. So not me, Paul saying so, but the Lord. Let not the wife depart from her husband, but if she depart, let her remain unmarried, agamos. And if she does not choose to remain unmarried, her only option is to be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. What's the implication? The text indicates here that the unmarried are those who were previously married. Remember, everybody, that the Corinthians church was actually a church of Gentiles. This was a case where these individuals lived by their own principles. They were not brought up in a strict Jewish setting. And in the Roman Empire, people were permitted to divorce. Even a woman could divorce her husband. In the Jewish context, a Jewish woman could only under certain circumstances, let me say not, under certain circumstances, she could divorce her husband. For example, if he was caught in the act of bestiality, she could divorce him. But not so in the Roman society. A woman was free to divorce for whatever reason she felt she needed to be divorced for, right? And in, well, I probably shouldn't put it that loosely, but it was a lot more liberal and women were allowed, right? So when you look at this text, Paul speaking to Corinthians, who are by nature Gentiles, he indicates that the unmarried are those who were previously married. So watch this. They are not widows, persons made single by death of a spouse. They are not virgins. The virgins are spoken of in verse 25, sexually pure. The unmarried appear to be persons who were married but were parted by divorce or separation, right? Paul is speaking to people who were divorced probably before coming to Christ. And they were asking the question, should we remain celibate or should we marry? That's the context of the argument, you know, everybody, right? So Paul is saying to them, it is good for them who are now free from marriage to remain unmarried. So he's not saying to the virgin that you should marry. He's saying to the unmarried that even as he is, it will be good for them. Verse 8 and 9 says, I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, watch this now, it is good for them if they abide even as I. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. Listen, implicit in this particular text is the idea that those being spoken to here, which are the unmarried, the agamos, and the widows, that they have already experienced sexual pleasure. So if they cannot contain, it's not speaking of the young virgin who has never had it. So the context is the people asking Paul whether or not it was better to be celibate or to become married are individuals. Some of them are individuals who were previously married and were now at a place where they literally wanted to know, now that they are saved, what they are to do. So you look at it and it says that it's a case where implicitly it is better. And one of the things I need to bring across here, Paul gives the reason for it, you know. He says the man that is unmarried or remains unmarried. And again, I want to say, brothers and sisters, that the reference here, based on the context, appears to be referring to persons who were once married and no longer married. So divorce and being a widow would have caused that, right? And the implications of verse 9, that if they cannot contain, let them marry, is not being referenced here so much to virgins who do not know what sexual pleasure is. The persons who are virgins who are not married, if they're going to remain celibate, it means that it is a gift that God has given them, a gift of self-discipline. And they've decided that they're going to give that to God. But it is not saying to young people who are unmarried and never married that, look, it's better if you not get married. It's not saying that. Because marriage, according to the writer of the Hebrews, is honorable and the bed is undefiled. So Paul is not speaking against marriage. Paul is saying for those who have already been married and for whatever reason you are no longer married, it is better for you to remain even as I, because you'll be a better servant to Christ, in the sense that instead of rebuilding and trying to put together a nest to please whosoever you're going to marry, you can turn all your attention up unto God. That's all he's saying, everybody. Now, both the widow and the divorced would have experienced sexual pleasure. But look here, the even as I term here implies that Paul may have been married. he puts himself in the group, right? No, in the ancient Jewish culture, Paul was a Pharisee, remember? And as a Pharisee, he would have seen marriage as a duty. The Pharisees saw marriage as a duty. It was a highly prized tradition to be married, right? To be a member of the ruling council. This was actually the Pharisees plus the Sadducees coming together, about 70 of them, to make up the parliament of Israel, the Sanhedrin council. One had to be married. And if Paul was a part of the Sanhedrin, as is implied by many of his writings, then he would have been married. So it could be that Paul was married and either his spouse died or when he converted, she left. We are not certain. We can't be certain. But the idea is that he's kind of, in a way, lumping himself implicitly when he says that if you're unmarried and if you're widowed, these two cases are the case of people who have been married before. He says, look here, you have gone through the thing. You know what it feel like. You know, it's better if you just stay as you are and just serve God. Yes? He's not saying to those who have never been married that, look here, you're not to get married. Hear what John MacArthur says. The point is that those who are single, when converted to Christ, should know that it is good for them to stay that way. And again, let me just say, single here is not making reference to those who have never been married, but those who have been married, but for whatever reason are no longer married. Excuse me. There is no need to rush marriage. Marriage is not necessary or superior to singleness, and it limits some potential for service to Christ. If the converted believer who is single and did not have self-control, that person should seek to marry. If a Christian is single but does not have the gift of singleness and is being strongly tempted sexually, he or she should pursue marriage. That's the idea. Can I tell you, everybody, that when Paul says, you know, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn, the term there is in what we call the aorist imperative. It's a command. Paul says, if you can't control yourself, go get married. Because if you don't get married, you are going to be consumed by lust. Right? So let's look here at the Christian marriages. So that would have answered the question, everybody, regarding those who may have been married before and are no longer married, right? But now we're going to get into the meat that is closer to the idea of divorce now. Verse 10 of chapter 7 says, and unto the married I command, yet not I but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband, but if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. So in this particular case, right, we find that the Lord is invoked as supreme authority. But what is being brought to bear here, everybody, is that in the case of the Christian marriage, if there is no adultery present and there was no sexual uncleanness, if one person decides to leave, then that person must remain unmarried or be reconciled unto the person they left. No, here's the dilemma. Some of the members of the Corinthians church probably wanted to divorce their partners. They just had, they don't want to stay with that person no longer. You know, for those who would listen to secular songs, years ago, there's a song that they call the Pina Colada song. Some of you may be the real name of the song is Escape by a guy called Rupert Holmes. He said he put an ad in the paper because he was tired of his wife, or not his wife, someone, but his girlfriend. And he put an ad in the paper, right? And he said in the ad that if you like pina coladas, and we know what a pina colada is, it's a drink with coconut and pineapple. If you like pina coladas, getting caught in the rain, if you're not into yoga, and if you're into champagne, if you like making love at midnight in the dunes of the Cape, then you are the one that I have looked for. Come with me and escape. It is a funny ballad. It's a funny song because in the end, somebody answered the ad, right? Or he saw the ad rather. He answered the ad, and it turned out that the person who placed the ad was his girlfriend. So the both of them were in the relationship, and they were just a little bored. So they were seeking elsewhere. That's probably what some of the Corinthians wanted. It wasn't a case of adultery, infidelity. They just believed that there was a more exciting life outside. Others had a desire to live holier, and they believed that they would live holier without a partner. Others may have wanted someone else that they found more desirable. And let me tell you something that, brothers and sisters, when they believe it's only outside of the walls of the church, even inside the walls of the church, there are some individuals who find other people more desirable than their current spouses. And then that's dangerous territory. Dangerous territory. Christians are not to even embrace or to entertain, rather, much less embrace such a thought. Many of them probably felt unfulfilled in their relationship. But Paul gave the prohibition. If you are married, two Christians married, and somebody chooses to leave, they must remain unmarried or be reconciled. Now, you may ask, there are a number of questions that come out of that, but we are going to get to that, right? So as a basic principle, I want you to embrace that. Christians are not supposed to divorce, not supposed to divorce each other. So in verse 10 of chapter 7, Paul is speaking to Christian couples. So he says, when you're a Christian, both of you are believers. You are not to divorce. And if you leave the partner, you must not remarry, because in the eyes of God, you are still connected to the partner in one flesh. So Paul is saying any other reason outside of adultery, you must remain unmarried. Divorce is contrary to the plan of God. And what that is saying in everybody is that before one gets divorced, just like before they get married, we must count the cost. We must count the cost. And I know the gray areas of abuse and all that, but we're going to get to that. But when somebody is just dissatisfied and decide that they don't want this man anymore, or they don't want this woman anymore, and they decide to just decide that they're going to divorce the person because it is permitted, according to what Paul is saying here, he says the individual who chooses to leave must remain unmarried, because the person who does not or has done this particular thing, and it's not because of adultery, is still married to the individual, right? And we're going to dovetail that into the idea of the bill of divorcement, and Moses' law that gave the woman the right to marry, and this situation here. Because on the one hand, Jesus is highlighting, and Paul would have understood, that the only premise or the only permission given for divorce was adultery, when the one flesh principle was broken, right? What would happen is that if one party deserted the other, went out of the marriage, gone foreign, married and start again, he would have deserted the other person. So therefore, adultery has come in, the marriage is broken, one party has become party to another flesh, by divorce or whatever, therefore the other will be permitted to marry. But if one gets up and make the decision to divorce his or her spouse, you must look to the fact that you may not be able to remarry if it was not based on or the divorce was not based on adultery in the eyes of God. Paul was not looking here at divorce based on adultery. He was looking at other reasons, right? Now Christians who divorce for reasons outside of adultery must remain unmarried or reconcile to their partner. That's what Paul is saying here. They are not free because they are still joined. Watch this. In God's eyes, marriage is dissolved in only three ways. One, by death. Two, by adultery. By three, by unbeliever desertion. But the married Christian must ensure that they remain unmarried. Both of them. Anyone that marries commits adultery. You get it? And the truth of the matter here is that because of one party going outside of the marriage, it becomes grounds. But the fact that we can look at that it was not adultery that caused it, But whatever happened in marriage now caused the adultery. That's something else that we're going to have to deal with. Yes? So watch this. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 15 and 16. This is why it is so important. Paul speaking again. Know ye not that your bodies are the members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them the members of a harlot? God forbid. What? Know ye not that he who is joined to a harlot is one with her? For two saith he shall be one flesh. That is why this sexual union is so pivotal, everyone. And that's why the devil perverts sexuality, because it is central to the expression of the sanctity of marriage. Now, when a man goes out and spends money and sleeps with a prostitute, according to the sacred scriptures, he has tied his life in to the prostitute. And I've said to persons often that when people get married, if the marriage is not consummated, the marriage can be annulled, because normally consummation is that final act that signifies that the two are one before God. It is not the kiss, that is not the vows that are spoken. It is not so much so simply the kiss that is given. It is not the documents that are signed before God. The marriage, the sexual coming together is the marriage. And that is why ancient Israel, the law was so strict that if a man would rape a woman, he would have to marry her or pay her father a certain amount of money. Why? Because when she was getting married, she would have to be a virgin. And I want to just put this out there, that I remember sharing that the blood covenant is the strongest covenant that is reflected in the scriptures. Jesus died for us through blood covenant. When a little girl is born, she has a particular membrane on her reproductive organs that is called the virgin's veil. That's what it is called. That will stay intact. Well, outside of any accident or, but that will stay intact until the first time that individual has sexual relations with a man. Now, based on how it is set, whenever intimacy takes place and there is that penile penetration, that virgin's veil, the hymen, as it's scientifically called, will break, and it will literally shed blood when it is broken. That blood that joins the man and the woman is literally the symbol that they've entered into a blood covenant together, a covenant for life. So ideally, that is what it was designed for. And I like to say to those who, many of us were not Christians before we became Christians, if you understand. But the good thing about it is that irrespective of if you weren't probably like that when you got married, the good thing is that you were born again. So it is still seen as a joining of innocence. But the truth of the matter is, when a man joins himself to a woman, or a woman to a man in sexual intimacy, they've married them. And I remember saying to a class I had that the woman taken, or the woman who met with Jesus, Jesus asked her, "Where is your husband?" She said, "I have none." Jesus said, "You have spoken rightly, because you've had 4 of them, and the one you have now is not your own." She did not take all 4 of these men to the altar, She had had relations with them. And she was currently in a relationship with a man who was not hers. So she's married to them. And so when a married person leaves the relationship and has intercourse with somebody else, it is not just a giving of pleasure. It is signifying that you are being joined, or the person is being joined to whosoever they have relations with. without being separated from the one. Are you getting it? So that's the idea. But the idea here is that if the believer is single by virtue of death, adultery, or desertion, then they can remarry. And wherever divorce is permitted, remarriage is also permitted. Let me see if I can close this. 1 Corinthians 7:32-34. But I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord. I explained this earlier. But he that is married careth for the things of the world, how he may please his wife. So again, the unmarried here does not reference those who were never married. It references those who were at one point married and were now single, either by divorce or by being widowed. There is difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. No, we want to extend let me find the right word, extend to those who are not yet married, those who would fall into the category of the virgin, not the unmarried, but those who are never a part of the marital union and they are children of God. Before one gets married, one must count the cost. It is a one-time and for all time relationship. For example, when Jesus was about to die on the cross, he wrestled with it in Gethsemane. And when he wrestled with it, he came down to the understand that it must be the will of God and not his will that prevails. Because when he died on the cross, he was dying one time and for all time. Marriage is like that. You have to count the cost. Whatever and whoever you marry, when you marry them, they are yours. And you told God you're keeping them until death. Right? Marriage is for purpose, not only for pleasure. And when somebody who is married wants to be a divorcee, one must not willy-nilly just arise and decide that they are going to be divorced. You must count the cost. Because if you are becoming or being divorced for anything outside of adultery, yes, sexual immorality, sexual uncleanness, according to what Paul writes here, he says you must remain unmarried. And bearing in mind, he said, I command. Then he doubles down. He said, not I, but the Lord. So except for adultery and sexual infidelity, the married individual, the married Christian, must remain married. No, the truth of the matter is simply this, that as we go further, you're going to see, and I think I'm almost sure next week we can wrap this up, that the scriptures speak to a situation where and this is the Christian marriage, we have not looked at the unbelieving marriage with an unbeliever. If the unbeliever decides that they no longer want to be a part of the marriage because the individual is a Christian, and he or she decides to leave, Paul again goes into the imperative and he says, let them leave. Don't stop them. In that case, again, it's Christian desertion. So the individual is free to marry. But when there are two believing Christians who have made their vows before God, where there can be repentance, there must be reconciliation, not divorce. If it is a case where there is abuse, and we've looked at some of these, it is believed, and we can infer from Paul, when he says, no man hurteth his own body, his own flesh. You can look at the writings in the book of Ephesians, when he speaks of giving honor and reverence and all that. You could recognize that if all of these commands are given, and there's one party abusing the other, or there's just fighting and it's getting close to murder or anything like that. It may be that separation for a time, and during that time, person must remain faithful. And further on, even if divorce comes, the individuals must be prepared to remain unmarried. Seems unfair. Seems unfair. But remember, everybody, and I'll say it again, fix it on the front end if you're not yet married. It's too late for those of us who have made the plunge. And some of us who want to be divorced, and some of us who are just happy in our marriage. The reality is that we have to count the cost. So whenever it is that someone is getting married, I remember in the vows that we lead people into, we said marriage should not be entered into unadvisedly, but it must be entered into advisedly, soberly, and in the fear of God. That is how marriage is to be done. And so if an individual gets married simply because they cannot contain themselves, they must also know that they have to remain with that person even after their sexual pleasure has come to its zenith. Even when they have reached the heights and can't go any higher, they have to remain with the individual. Why? Because when an individual gets married, you're marrying another person in whom is the image of God. It's not marrying an object that you can play with like a toy. You're marrying another individual who Christ died for. So by virtue of that, it must be treated with the greatest of honor and the greatest of respect. So brothers and sisters, when we meet again, we'll be looking at the idea of we just looked at the saved married, those who are Christians. We're going to look at those who are non-Christians, and then we're going to look at the sole exception, where Jesus speaks of adultery, or not adultery, fornication, being the sole thing. Because even in adultery, there is an opening for forgiveness. And so, brothers and sisters, let me thank you again for being with us. Let me extend warmest regards to those who joined us. And I look forward to seeing you again as we come together to look at this whole thing of divorce and remarriage. And it is important that we understand that our lives, and I want to really put this out there, our lives are a test upon the earth to see whether or not we are fit for immortality and fit for the kingdom. Earthly pleasures and having pleasures upon the earth are not an all in all. And one of the things that I used to like about the old church, they would sing a song that says, I don't want to get adjusted to this world. Many of the people of the old church did not have our level of education, did not have our opportunities, did not even have the luxuries that we have today, and they would stay married for life. And so I want to just thank you for joining and leave you with that little tidbit for thought, that marriage is God honoring and divorce is rebellion, save for the sake of sexual uncleanness. Divorce is rebellion. And so, my brothers and sisters, I just want to thank you again for being with us. And I want to commend you for staying with us as we looked at this very controversial topic. And we want to, at this time, say a good night to you as we thank you for being with us. God bless you and walk good. And I pray that you will again take a little time to join with us next week, the Lord tarries, at 7 p.m. as we continue with this great study on divorce and remarriage. Shalom, everyone. God bless you.